The unforgiving sun beat down on the Texas plains, mirroring the harsh reality of Abigail's life. A widow at 24, drowning in debt with nothing but a failing farm and the ghost of her husband's dreams. Every knock at the door sent a tremor of fear through her. Was it the bank coming to take what little she had left? But the man who collapsed on her doorstep wasn't the villain she expected. He was a stranger, broken and starving. In an act of desperate compassion, she gave him her last piece of bread, an act of kindness that would unravel a web of secrets and change her life forever. The heat was a physical presence in Redemption, Texas, in the summer of 1888. It shimmered in wooves off the baked earth, distorted the horizon, and pressed down with the weight of a physical blanket. For Abigail Ann Dawson, it was just another layer of the suffocating burden she'd carried for 6 months, ever since the fever had taken her husband, Thomas. He had been a man of grand dreams, his head filled with visions of a sprawling cattle ranch, a legacy carved from the unforgiving Texas soil. But dreams, Abigail had learned with a bitter certainty, were no defense against the harsh realities of life and death. Their small homestead, 160 acres of stubborn dirt and struggling crops, was all that remained of those dreams. The cattle, a small herd of longhorns Thomas had purchased with a loan from the bank in San Angelo, had been sold off one by one to pay for the doctor and then the funeral. The fields once meticulously tended were now a patchwork of wilting corn and scorched earth, a testament to her failing strength and dwindling hope. The farmhouse itself, a simple 2-room structure of rough-hewn pine, seemed to sigh with the same weariness that had settled deep in her bones. Inside, the air was thick and still tasting of dust, and the faint cloying scent of wilted wildflowers she'd placed in a jar on the windowsill, a futile attempt to bring a touch of life to the suffocating stillness. The larder, once stocked with jars of preserves and sacks of flour, was now a hollow echo of its former self. A half-empty sack of cornmeal, a small jar of molasses, and a handful of dried beans were all that stood between her and starvation. The debt was a constant gnawing presence, a spectre that haunted her waking hours and crept into her dreams. $247. The number was seared into her memory, each digit a brand of failure. The loan had been taken out against the farm, a gamble on a future that had died with Thomas. The banker, a man named Bartholomew Hayes, was a shadowy figure in her mind, a name on a piece of paper, a faceless entity of immense power. She'd never met him, had only corresponded through terse, impersonal letters that arrived with an unnerving regularity, each one a stark reminder of her precarious situation. The latest letter, which had arrived a week prior, lay on the small, scarred table, its edges softened by her repeated anxious handling. The crisp, elegant script, so at odds with the rough-hewn world she inhabited, delivered its message with brutal clarity. Payment was due, in full, by the end of the month. Failure to comply would result in foreclosure. The words were a death sentence, the final nail in the coffin of her and Thomas's dreams. Abigail ran a hand over her face, her fingers tracing the lines of exhaustion that had taken root around her eyes. She was only 24, but she felt ancient, worn down by a grief that was as relentless as the Texas sun. She looked at her hands, calloused and stained with dirt, the hands of a farmer, not the soft, delicate hands of the woman Thomas had married. She had fought. She had struggled. She had poured every ounce of her being into this land. But it wasn't enough. The world, it seemed, was a place where dreams went to die. A sudden sharp knock at the door jolted her from her despair. Her heart leaped into her throat, a frantic, trapped bird. The bank. It had to be. They'd sent someone. The sheriff, perhaps, to deliver the eviction notice in person. She squeezed her eyes shut, a silent, desperate prayer on her lips. Not yet. Please, not yet. Her first instinct was to hide, to pretend she wasn't there, to retreat into the shadows and let the inevitable pass her by. But then, a wave of defiance, a spark of the stubborn pride she'd inherited from her father rose within her. This was her home. She would not cower in the face of her fate. Taking a deep, steadying breath, she smoothed down her worn calico dress, a futile gesture of dignity, and walked to the door. Her hand trembled as she reached for the latch, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She braced herself for the sight of a stern-faced man with a badge and a piece of paper, the final official decree of her ruin. But when she pulled the door open, it wasn't the sheriff who stood on her porch. It was a stranger, a man she'd never seen before, his face obscured by the wide brim of a sweat-stained hat. He was tall and lean-dressed in dusty, travel-worn clothes that hung loosely on his frame. He swayed on his feet, his hand gripping the porch post for support. His shoulders slumped with an exhaustion that mirrored her own. For a long moment, they simply stood there. Two strangers on a dusty porch, their lives colliding in a silent, uncertain tableau. The man didn't speak, didn't move, his presence a question mark against the backdrop of her despair. And in that moment, Abigail's fear, the cold, gnawing terror that had been her constant companion, receded, replaced by a flicker of something else. Curiosity, and a strange, unexpected pang of pity. This man, whoever he was, looked as lost and broken as she felt. The stranger finally lifted his head, and the brim of his hat tilted back, revealing a face that was a road map of hardship. His skin was leathery and tanned, etched with fine lines around his eyes and mouth. His beard, a scruffy salt and pepper affair, was matted with dust, and his eyes, a startlingly pale blue, were clouded with a weariness that seemed to go beyond mere physical exhaustion. He looked to be in his late 40s, a man who had seen more than his share of life's cruelties. He opened his mouth to speak, but only a dry, rasping sound emerged. He cleared his throat, a painful, hacking cough that shook his entire frame, and tried again. Water. He croaked, his voice barely a whisper. Please, just a little water. Without a word, Abigail turned and went back inside her heart, a tumultuous mix of pity and suspicion. Who was this man? A drifter, a fugitive. In these parts, a stranger could be anything, and a lone woman had to be cautious. But the desperate plea in his eyes, the raw, unvarnished need, had cut through her fear. She couldn't turn him away. She returned with a dipper of cool water from the well, her hand steady as she offered it to him. He drank greedily, the water spilling down his chin and onto his dusty shirt. He drained the dipper, and then another, his Adam's apple bobbing with each desperate swallow. When he was finished, he let out a long, shuddering sigh, a sound of profound relief that seemed to come from the very depths of his soul. Thank you, he said, his voice a little stronger now. Thank you, Ma'am. You don't know what that means. It's just water, she replied, her voice soft. To a man dying of thirst, he said, his pale eyes meeting hers. It's life itself. He seemed to gather himself then, to pull himself up from the brink of collapse. He straightened his shoulders, a flicker of pride in his bearing, and took off his hat, revealing a full head of thick greying hair damp with sweat. "My apologies for the intrusion, ma'am. I seem to have lost my way. My horse went lame a few miles back. I was trying to get to San Angelo, but this heat..." He trailed off, his gaze drifting to the parched landscape beyond her porch. San Angelo. The name sent a fresh jolt of anxiety through her. The bank. Mr. Bartholomew Hayes. Was it possible this man was connected to her troubles? A debt collector perhaps sent to assess her property before the foreclosure. The thought sent a fresh wave of fear washing over her, cold and sharp. She studied him more closely, her eyes searching for any sign of deception, any hint of a hidden agenda. But all she saw was a man at the end of his rope, a man who looked as though he hadn't had a decent meal in days. His face was gaunt, his cheekbones sharp, and his clothes, which had once been of good quality, were now threadbare and patched. Her gaze fell to the sack of cornmeal on the table, the last of her provisions. A fierce protective instinct rose within her. It was all she had. To share it would be to hasten her own demise. But then she looked at the stranger again, at the quiet desperation in his eyes, and she saw a reflection of her own despair. She saw a fellow human being caught in the relentless grip of a world that offered little in the way of kindness or mercy. In that moment, a choice presented itself to her, a choice between self-preservation and compassion. It was a choice that would have been unthinkable just a few months ago, when her life was still whole, when her future was still a bright, shining promise. But grief had changed her, had stripped away the certainties, and left her with a raw, aching vulnerability. It had also, she realized, opened her heart in a way she never would have expected. "You look hungry," she said the words, surprising even herself. The stranger's eyes widened, a flicker of disbelief in their pale depths. He seemed about to protest, to deny his need, but then his pride crumbled, and he gave a slow, weary nod. I wouldn't say no to a bite, ma'am, if it's not too much trouble." "It's no trouble," she lied, her voice more confident than she felt. "Come in. Sit down. It's not much, but you're welcome to what I have." She led him to the small table, her heart pounding a nervous rhythm against her ribs. What was she doing? Inviting a stranger into her home, offering him the last of her food. It was madness, and yet it felt right. It felt like the only thing to do. She set about preparing a simple meal of cornbread and beans, her movements deft and sure, a familiar rhythm in a world that had become so terrifyingly unfamiliar. The stranger sat in silence, his hat in his lap, his gaze fixed on her every move. He didn't speak, didn't ask any questions, but his presence filled the small room a silent, watchful energy that was both unsettling and strangely comforting. As the cornbread baked in the small cast-iron stove, its warm, earthy scent filling the air, a sense of calm settled over Abigail. For the first time in months, she felt a flicker of purpose, a sense of connection to another human being. It was a small thing, a shared meal with a stranger, but in the vast, empty landscape of her grief, it felt like an anchor. When the meal was ready, she placed it on the table between them, a steaming plate of cornbread and a small bowl of beans. The stranger looked at the food with an intensity that was almost painful to watch. He picked up his fork, his hand trembling slightly, and took a bite of the cornbread. He closed his eyes, a look of pure, unadulterated bliss on his face. This is the best thing I've ever tasted," he said, his voice thick with emotion. Abigail smiled, a genuine, unforced smile that had become a rarity in her life. "It's just cornbread," she said. "No, ma'am," he replied, his pale eyes meeting hers. "It's a feast." They ate in silence, the only sounds the clinking of their forks against the plates and the soft sigh of the wind outside. As she watched the stranger eat, a strange sense of peace settled over Abigail. She had given him what little she had, and in doing so she had found a small piece of herself that she thought was lost forever. The fear was still there, a low, persistent hum beneath the surface, but for now, in this small, quiet moment, it was overshadowed by a flicker of hope. A hope that was as fragile and as precious as the last embers of a dying fire. As the last of the cornbread disappeared, a tentative sort of ease settled between them. The stranger, his hunger sated, seemed to shed some of the desperate weariness he had carried in with him. He leaned back in his chair, a sigh of contentment escaping his lips. "I am in your debt, ma'am," he said, his voice retaining a formal, educated cadence that seemed at odds with his disheveled appearance. "You've shown me a kindness I won't soon forget." "Think nothing of it," Abigail replied, though the thought of her own empty larder sent a fresh pang of anxiety through her. "We all need a little help now and then." "That we do," he agreed, his pale eyes thoughtful. "More than we care to admit." He paused, then extended a hand across the table. "My name is Sterling, ma'am." "John Sterling." Abigail hesitated for a fraction of a second before taking his hand. His grip was firm, his skin rough but clean. "Abigail Dawson, a pleasure, Dawson." His gaze flickered to her left hand, where the faint indentation of her wedding band remained, though she had sold the ring itself months ago. A shadow of sadness crossed his face, a fleeting expression of shared understanding. "My condolences." Abigail's breath caught in her throat. How did he know? Then she realized. Her black dress, the somber air of the house, the absence of a man's presence. It was all there to see a story written in the stark details of her life. "Thank you," she whispered the words, thick with unshed tears. "I too have known loss," Mr. Sterling said softly, his voice a low, gentle rumble. "My own dear wife, Eleanor, passed some years ago. The world is a colder place without her. An unexpected bond formed between them. In that moment, a shared sorrow that transcended their status as strangers. Abigail found herself opening up the words, tumbling out of her in a rush, as if a dam had broken within her. She told him about Thomas, about his dreams, about the fever that had stolen him from her. She spoke of her struggles to keep the farm afloat, of the loneliness that was a constant, aching presence in her life. Mr. Sterling listened with a quiet, unwavering attention, his pale eyes never leaving her face. He didn't offer empty platitudes or easy reassurances. He simply listened, his silence a comforting embrace. When she had finished, her voice raw with emotion, he nodded slowly, his expression one of deep, heartfelt empathy. "You are a strong woman, Dawson," he said, his voice filled with a genuine admiration. "Stronger than you know." His words were a balm to her wounded spirit, a small, precious gift in a world that had given her nothing but hardship. A fragile trust began to take root between them, a sense of connection that was as unexpected as it was welcome. "You said you were heading to San Angelo," she said, her curiosity getting the better of her. "Business." A flicker of something unreadable passed through his eyes, a momentary shuttering of his emotions. You could say that he replied, his voice carefully neutral. "I have an account to settle." The word account sent a familiar chill down her spine. With the bank, she asked, her voice barely a whisper. He looked at her, his expression unreadable. You know of it. Everyone in these parts knows of the Consolidated Bank of San Angelo, she said, a bitter edge to her voice, and of its owner, Mr. Bartholomew Hayes. At the mention of the name, a strange, almost imperceptible tension entered the room. Mr. Sterling's posture stiffened slightly, and his gaze sharpened. What do you know of Mr. Hayes? He asked, his voice carefully casual. Only what I've heard, she said, the words spilling out of her in a rush of long-held resentment. That he's a ruthless man, a man who built his fortune on the misfortunes of others. They say he has a heart of stone that he'd foreclose on his own mother if she missed a payment. She picked at a loose thread on her dress, her gaze fixed on the table. I've never met him, thank God. But his letters, they're as cold and hard as the man himself. She looked up, then expecting to see a nod of agreement, a shared look of disdain for the faceless villain who held their fates in his hands. But the expression on Mr. Sterling's face was not what she expected. He was watching her with an intensity that was almost unnerving. His pale eyes searching her face as if he were trying to read her very soul. And what if I were to tell you, he said, his voice low and even, that you are mistaken? What if I were to tell you that Mr. Hayes is not the man you think he is? Abigail stared at him, a knot of confusion tightening in her stomach. I don't understand. People are not always what they seem. Dawson, he said, his voice taking on a cryptic, almost philosophical tone. Sometimes the stories we hear, the reputations that precede a man, they are nothing more than smoke and mirrors, a facade to hide the truth of who he really is. He leaned forward, his elbows on the table, his gaze holding hers captive. Tell me, Dawson, he said, his voice a low, compelling whisper. If you were to meet this Mr. Hayes, this man you believe to be so heartless, what would you say to him? The question caught her off guard. She had spent so much time cursing his name, imagining him as a monstrous, shadowy figure, that she had never actually considered what she would say to him if they were to meet face to face. She began, her voice faltering. I would tell him that he is destroying people's lives, that his pieces of paper and his columns of figures, they don't tell the whole story. They don't tell of the sweat and the tears, the hopes and the dreams that are tied to this land. I would tell him that he is not just foreclosing on a farm. He is foreclosing on a future. Her voice grew stronger as she spoke, fueled by a righteous anger that had been simmering within her for months. I would tell him that a man's worth is not measured by the gold in his coffers, but by the kindness in his heart, and that by that measure Mr. Bartholomew Hayes is the poorest man in Texas. She finished, her chest heaving, her words hanging in the still hot air between them. Mr. Sterling sat in silence, his expression unreadable. The silence stretched on thick and heavy until Abigail began to feel a prickle of unease. Had she said too much? Had she offended this stranger with her outburst? But when he finally spoke, his voice was not angry. It was soft, almost gentle, and tinged with a sadness that she couldn't quite decipher. Thank you, Dawson, he said, his pale eyes glistening with an emotion she couldn't name. You have given me much to think about. He rose from the table. Then a sudden, decisive movement that seemed to signal an end to their conversation. I must be going, he said, his voice returning to its former, more formal tone. I have delayed long enough. But your horse, she began. I'll manage, he said, his voice firm. San Angelo is not so far now, and I have a renewed sense of purpose. He walked to the door, his tall frame silhouetted against the harsh afternoon light. He paused on the threshold, his back to her, and for a long moment she thought he was going to leave without another word. But then he turned his face a mask of conflicting emotions and looked at her one last time. "You are a remarkable woman, Abigail Dawson," he said, his voice low and earnest. "Do not let anyone, not even a man with a heart of stone, tell you otherwise." And with that, he was gone. A solitary figure walking down the dust-choked road, his shadow stretching long and thin behind him. Abigail stood in the doorway, her heart a whirlwind of confusion and a strange, unsettling premonition. She had the distinct feeling that her encounter with John Sterling was not an end, but a beginning of something that would change her life in ways she could not possibly imagine. The stranger's visit left an indelible mark on the quiet, suffocating stillness of Abigail's life. The farmhouse, which had been a tomb of grief and despair, now seemed to echo with the memory of his presence, the low rumble of his voice, the quiet intensity of his gaze. She found herself replaying their conversation over and over in her mind, dissecting every word, every nuance, every fleeting expression. His defense of Bartholomew Hayes was a puzzle she couldn't solve. Why would a man who seemed to be in a similar state of financial distress, a man who was on his way to settle an account with the bank, speak of the ruthless banker with such a strange, almost protective tone? It didn't make sense. And his final words, his cryptic pronouncement of her own worth, had stirred something within her, a flicker of defiance that had long been dormant. 2 days later, her solitude was interrupted by another visitor. This time it was a familiar face, Martha Ann Crabtree, her closest neighbor, and one of the few people in Redemption who hadn't treated her with a mixture of pity and morbid curiosity since Thomas's death. Martha Ann was a woman in her late 50s, with a face as weathered as the Texas landscape and a heart as big as the sky. She arrived in a cloud of dust, her buckboard laden with a basket of fresh eggs, a slab of bacon, and a small sack of flour. "I saw you had a visitor the other day," she said, her sharp eyes missing nothing as she bustled into the small kitchen. Her presence a whirlwind of maternal energy. A tall fellow with a weary look about him. Didn't recognize him. "A drifter, I suppose." Abigail hesitated, a strange reluctance to share the details of her encounter with the stranger. "Something like that," she said, her voice non-committal. "He was just passing through. Needed some water." Martha Ann shot her a shrewd look. "Just water, Abigail Dawson. I know you better than that. You've got a heart as soft as a summer peach. You fed him, didn't you?" Abigail flushed, a faint blush rising to her cheeks. "He was hungry." Martha Ann snorted, but there was a twinkle of affection in her eyes. "You'll be the death of yourself with that soft heart of yours. This is a hard country, child. You can't go around feeding every stray that wanders onto your porch." She paused, her expression turning serious. "You need to be careful. A lone woman like yourself. It's not safe." "He was harmless," Abigail insisted, though a small seed of doubt had been planted in her mind. "They all seem harmless at first," Martha Ann said, her voice low and cautionary. "But you never know what's lurking in a man's heart, especially a man with no name and no past." She began unpacking her basket, her movements brisk and efficient. "Speaking of men with no hearts," she said, her voice laced with a familiar disdain, "I heard some news in town yesterday. About our dear Mr. Hayes." Abigail's breath caught in her throat. "What about him?" Seems the old devil is making a trip to redemption. Martha Ann said, her lips tightening into a thin, disapproving line. Coming to inspect his properties, they say. Or more likely to gloat over the misery of the poor souls he's about to throw out on the street. A wave of nausea washed over Abigail. Hayes. Coming here. The faceless villain of her nightmares was about to become a flesh and blood reality. The thought sent a fresh wave of terror through her, cold and sharp, when she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Sometime next week, I reckon, Martha Ann said, her gaze softening as she saw the look of fear on Abigail's face. Now don't you go worrying yourself sick over it. Something will turn up. The Lord provides. But Abigail's faith had been stretched to its breaking point. The Lord hadn't provided when Thomas had been struck down by the fever. The Lord hadn't provided when the crops had withered and died in the relentless sun. Why would he provide now? As Martha Ann continued to chatter, her voice a comforting drone in the background, Abigail's mind raced. Hayes. Here. In redemption. And then a thought, a wild, improbable connection flashed through her mind. Mr. Sterling. He was on his way to San Angelo to settle an account. He had defended Hayes, spoken of him with a strange, almost personal knowledge. What if he wasn't just a drifter? What if he was connected to Hayes in some way? An employee, perhaps? A messenger? The thought was both terrifying and strangely exhilarating. If Sterling worked for Hayes, then perhaps he could be an ally, a voice of reason in the lion's den. He had seen her situation firsthand, had witnessed her desperation, had been the recipient of her kindness. Surely he would speak to Hayes on her behalf, plead her case, appeal to whatever shred of humanity the man might possess. But then another darker thought slithered into her mind. What if Sterling's visit had not been a coincidence? What if he had been sent by Hayes to spy on her, to assess her vulnerability, to gather information that could be used against her? The thought sent a chill down her spine, a cold, sickening dread that extinguished the flicker of hope that had been kindled in her heart. She thought of the way he had watched her, the intensity of his gaze, the careful, probing nature of his questions. She had poured out her heart to him, had revealed her deepest fears, and resentments had laid bare the full extent of her desperation. And he had listened, his expression unreadable, his true motives hidden behind a mask of weary sympathy. The kindness she had shown him, the meal she had shared with him, now seemed like a foolish, reckless act. She had not just fed a stranger. She had fed the enemy. She had armed him with the knowledge of her weakness, had given him the ammunition he needed to destroy her. When Martha Ann finally left her basket empty, and her heart full of concern for her young friend Abigail, was left alone with her swirling thoughts, her mind a battlefield of conflicting emotions. The hope that had been a fragile ember was now a raging fire of suspicion and fear. She went to the window and stared out at the dust-choked road, the road that had brought the stranger to her door, and had then carried him away. He was a shadow, a mystery, a man who had entered her life and then vanished, leaving behind a trail of unanswered questions and a growing sense of dread. The sun began to set, painting the sky in fiery hues of orange and red, a beautiful, brutal spectacle that offered no comfort. The world, it seemed, was not a place of kindness and mercy, but a place of deception and betrayal. And in this world, Abigail Dawson was utterly, terrifyingly alone. The days that followed were a blur of anxious waiting. Every passing rider on the road sent a jolt of panic through Abigail. Every knock at the door made her heart leap into her throat. The spectre of Bartholomew Hayes loomed large in her imagination, a monstrous figure of immense power, coming to cast his final damning judgment upon her. She had all but convinced herself that Mr. Sterling was a spy, a Judas who had accepted her hospitality only to betray her. The memory of their shared meal, which had once been a source of comfort, now tasted of ashes in her mouth. She had been a fool, a naive, trusting fool, and she was about to pay the price for her sentimentality. On the third day after Martha Ann's visit, a sleek black buggy pulled by two magnificent high-stepping horses appeared on the horizon. It was a sight so alien, so out of place in the rugged, unforgiving landscape of redemption, that it seemed to have materialized from another world. Abigail watched from her window, her heart a leaden weight in her chest, as the buggy drew closer, its polished wheels kicking up a cloud of dust. It stopped in front of her farmhouse, a stark, imposing symbol of wealth and power against the backdrop of her own poverty and despair. The driver, a man in a crisp black uniform, jumped down and opened the passenger door, and the man who stepped out was not the monstrous, shadowy figure of her nightmares. He was tall and lean, dressed in a finely tailored suit of dark grey wool. His hair was thick and greying his beard neatly trimmed, and his eyes, a startlingly pale blue, were fixed on her with an expression of quiet, unreadable intensity. It was John Sterling. For a long moment, Abigail could do nothing but stare her mind, struggling to process the impossible sight before her. The drifter, the man she had fed at her table, the man she had suspected of being a spy, was standing before her, dressed in the clothes of a wealthy, powerful man. He walked towards her, his movements slow and deliberate, his gaze never leaving her face. He stopped at the foot of her porch, his expression a mixture of apology and regret. "Dawson," he said, his voice the same low, gentle rumble she remembered, but now laced with a new authority. "I believe we have some unfinished business." Abigail found her voice a hoarse, strangled whisper. Who are you?" He gave a small, sad smile, a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "I believe you already know the answer to that question, Dawson." He reached into his coat pocket and produced a small, leather-bound card case. He extracted a card and offered it to her. Her hand trembled as she took it. The card was thick and expensive, the lettering embossed in elegant gold script, and the name on the card, the name that seemed to leap out at her, a brand of fire on her soul, was Bartholomew Hayes, President, Consolidated Bank of San Angelo. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. The air rushed out of her lungs, and she gripped the porch post for support, her knuckles white. The stranger, the drifter, the man she had pitied and then feared, was Bartholomew Hayes, the ruthless banker, the man with a heart of stone. A wave of dizziness washed over her, and for a moment she thought she was going to faint. But then a surge of anger, hot and fierce, coursed through her veins, burning away the shock and confusion. "You lied to me," she said, her voice shaking with a rage she hadn't known she possessed. "You came into my home, you ate my food, you let me pour out my heart to you, and all the while you were lying to me. I did not lie to you, Dawson," he said, his voice soft, almost pleading. "I simply omitted certain details." "Details," she cried, her voice rising to a near hysterical pitch. "You call your name, your entire identity, a mere detail." She threw the card at his feet, a small, futile gesture of defiance. "Get off my land, Mr. Hayes. You are not welcome here." "Please, Dawson," he said. his voice filled with a genuine anguish that cut through her anger. "Just hear me out. That is all I ask. Why should I?" She spat, her eyes blazing with unshed tears. "So you can spin another web of lies. So you can gloat over your clever deception." "No," he said, his voice firm, compelling, "so I can tell you the truth." He took a step closer, his pale eyes searching her face, pleading for a chance to explain. And despite her anger, despite her sense of betrayal, Abigail found herself hesitating. There was a sincerity in his voice, a raw, unvarnished emotion in his eyes that she couldn't ignore. "You have 5 minutes," she said, her voice cold and hard, but her heart a tumultuous mix of anger, confusion, and a strange, unwilling curiosity. He nodded, a look of profound relief on his face. He began to speak, his voice low and earnest, and the story he told was not the one she had expected. He told her of a man who had inherited a bank from his father, a man who had been taught from a young age that the world was a brutal, unforgiving place, a world where sentiment had no place, where the bottom line was the only thing that mattered. He told her of a man who had built a wall around his heart, a wall of gold and power, a wall to protect himself from the pain and vulnerability of human connection. He told her of a man who had grown weary of the empty, sterile world he had created for himself, a man who was haunted by the faces of the people whose lives he had destroyed with the stroke of a pen. He told her of a man who had decided to walk away from it all, to shed his identity like a snake sheds its skin, and to see the world not from the lofty perch of a banker's office, but from the dusty, unforgiving ground of the common man. "I wanted to see the faces behind the names on the ledgers," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I wanted to understand the lives I was impacting. I wanted to see if there was any kindness left in the world, any kindness left in me." He paused, his gaze fixed on her with a desperate intensity. "And then I came to your door, a stranger, broken and starving. And you, Dawson, you who had every reason to hate me, every reason to turn me away, you showed me a kindness that I have not known in a very long time." He took a deep, shuddering breath, his composure finally cracking. "You did not just feed me, Dawson. You saved me. You saved me from the man I had become." Abigail stared at him, her anger slowly, inexorably dissolving, replaced by a wave of stunned, disbelieving empathy. The man standing before her was not the heartless villain of her imagination. He was a man in pain, a man as lost and broken as she was. The silence that fell between them was no longer thick with anger and suspicion. It was a fragile, tentative space, a space where two broken souls, two people from two different worlds, had found a common ground. The unveiling was complete. The mask had been removed, the truth revealed. And in the harsh, unforgiving light of the Texas sun, something new and unexpected had been born. A connection, a bond, a fragile, improbable hope. The revelation hung in the air between them, heavy and shimmering, like the midday heat. Abigail's anger had evaporated, leaving behind the hollow ache of confusion. The world which had seemed so starkly black and white just moments before, a world of victims and villains, of the powerless and the powerful, had suddenly become a landscape of bewildering grey. This man, this Bartholomew Hayes, was not the monster she had created in her mind. He was flesh and blood, a man burdened by his own kind of poverty, a poverty of the soul. His confession had not been a plea for forgiveness, but a raw, unvarnished laying bare of his own brokenness. It was a reckoning not just for him, but for her as well. So what now? She asked, her voice quiet, devoid of the fire it had held just moments before. Have you seen what you came to see? Are you satisfied? Will you be taking my farm? Hayes flinched, as if she had struck him. The question, so practical, so rooted in the harsh reality of her situation, seemed to pull him back from the precipice of his emotional confession. He looked away from her, his gaze sweeping over the small, struggling farm, the wilting corn, the parched earth. He saw it now, not as an asset on a ledger, a collection of numbers, but as a home, a dream, a testament to a love that had been lost. The stories you heard about me, Dawson. He began, his voice raspy with unshed tears. They were not entirely untrue. I have been a hard man. I have made decisions that have caused great suffering. I have valued profit over people. He turned back to her, his pale eyes filled with a self-loathing that was painful to witness. The man who wrote you those letters, he was a man I no longer wish to be. He took a step towards her, then another, until he was standing on the porch, so close she could see the fine lines of exhaustion etched around his eyes. When I sat at your table, he continued, his voice dropping to an intimate whisper, and you placed that plate of cornbread before me. You did not see a banker. You did not see a man of wealth and power. You saw a human being in need, and you gave without question from what little you had. He reached out his hand, hovering in the air between them for a moment, before he gently, tentatively touched her arm. His touch was not one of possession or power, but one of profound, heartfelt gratitude. That simple act of kindness, Dawson, it was a lesson in humanity that no amount of money could ever buy. It held up a mirror to my own soul, and I was horrified by the reflection. Abigail didn't pull away. She stood rooted to the spot, her heart a maelstrom of conflicting emotions. Pity, anger, confusion, and a strange, unsettling sense of connection to this man who had been her tormentor. She had hated the name Bartholomew Hayes had cursed. It had prayed for his damnation. But the man who stood before her was not a name on a piece of paper. He was a man in the throes of a profound, life-altering crisis. I cannot undo the past. He said, his voice thick with regret. I cannot bring back your husband. I cannot erase the pain and the fear I have caused you. But I can try to make amends. He released her arm and reached into his coat pocket again. This time, he did not produce a business card. He pulled out a folded piece of paper. It was the loan agreement. Her loan agreement. The document that had been the source of so much of her misery. He unfolded it, the crisp paper crackling in the still air. He held it up for her to see the elegant script and the damning numbers, a stark reminder of the power he held over her. And then, in a gesture that was both simple and profound, he tore it in half. And then in half again. And again, until the pieces were nothing more than small, meaningless scraps of paper. He opened his hand and let the pieces fall to the dusty porch floor, a confetti of forgiven debt. The debt is cancelled, Dawson, he said, his voice firm, unwavering. The farm is yours. Free and clear. Abigail stared at the scraps of paper at her feet, then back at his face, her mind struggling to comprehend the magnitude of what had just happened. The weight that had been crushing her for so long, the suffocating burden of her debt, had been lifted. Just like that. But it was not a moment of pure, unadulterated joy. It was a moment of profound, unsettling complexity. This act of generosity, this grand gesture of redemption, was born from a deception. It was a gift from a man. She had hated a man who had only come to understand her plight because he had lied to her. Tears welled in her eyes, but they were not tears of gratitude. They were tears of confusion, of emotional exhaustion of a world that had been turned upside down. Why, she whispered the single word encompassing a universe of questions. "Because you showed me what it means to be human again," he replied, his voice soft, almost reverent. "You showed me that kindness is a currency far more valuable than gold. You showed me that a man's worth is not measured by what he has, but by what he gives." He took a step back, a respectful distance, giving her space to process the seismic shift that had just occurred in her life. The reckoning was complete. The accounts had been settled not with the cold, hard logic of finance, but with the messy, unpredictable currency of human emotion. The sun beat down on the small farmhouse, on the man in the tailored suit and the woman in the faded calico dress. The pieces of the torn loan agreement lay scattered on the porch, a silent testament to the extraordinary events of the day, and in the quiet, dusty stillness of the Texas afternoon. Two broken people, a banker and a widow, began to pick up the pieces of their shattered lives, and perhaps to build something new. The silence that followed his pronouncement was not empty. It was filled with the weight of unspoken emotions of a future that had been rewritten in a single dramatic moment. Abigail looked at the pieces of paper on the porch, the physical manifestation of her freedom, and then at the man who had given it to her. The anger was gone, the fear had subsided, but a sense of profound unease remained. I can't accept this," she said the words, surprising even herself. They were born not of pride, but of a deep-seated sense of justice, a feeling that this was too easy. A life of hardship could not be erased by a single act of charity, no matter how well-intentioned. Hayes looked at her, his expression not of surprise, but of understanding. "I know," he said, softly. "I know it feels unearned." It's not that she said, struggling to articulate the complex tangle of emotions in her heart. It's that you can't just ride in here and fix everything with a wave of your hand. My husband is still gone. My fields are still barren, and my life is still my own to live. I have to make my own way. I have to earn my own salvation. She was not just a damsel in distress waiting to be rescued by a wealthy benefactor. She was a woman who had fought, who had struggled, who had survived. To simply accept his charity would be to diminish her own strength, her own resilience. A slow smile spread across Hayes's face, a genuine, unforced smile that reached his eyes and transformed his weary, careworn features. "You are an extraordinary woman, Abigail Dawson," he said, his voice filled with a quiet admiration. "And you are right. A simple cancellation of debt is not enough. It does not honor the spirit of the woman who shared her last meal with a stranger." He paused, his mind clearly working, a new idea taking shape. "So let us not call it charity," he said, his voice taking on a new energy, the energy of a man who has found a new purpose. "Let us call it an investment." Abigail looked at him, a flicker of interest in her eyes. "An investment?" "Yes," he said, his voice growing stronger, more confident. "I am a banker after all. It is what I do. But this time I will not be investing in land or cattle. I will be investing in a person. I will be investing in you." He began to pace the small porch, his movements filled with a newfound enthusiasm. "You have the land. You have the knowledge. You have the will. What you lack are the resources. I will provide them. New seed, new equipment, a new well if need be, and laborers to help you work the land. Not as a gift, Dawson, as a partnership." He stopped and looked at her, his pale eyes shining with a light she had not seen before. "We will draw up a new agreement. A fair one. You will be the manager of this farm, with a full share of the profits, and I will be your silent partner, an investor who trusts in the strength and integrity of his investment." Abigail stared at him, her mind reeling. A partnership. It was a radical, audacious proposal. It was not charity. It was an offer of respect, of equality. It was a chance to rebuild her life, not on the shifting sands of another's pity, but on the solid ground of her own hard work and determination. A slow, hesitant smile touched her lips, the first genuine smile of hope she had felt in a very long time. "And what of you, Mr. Hayes?" she asked, a hint of her former fire returning to her voice. "Will you be returning to your bank, to your world of ledgers and accounts?" He shook his head, a look of profound certainty on his face. "No," he said. "That life is over. I have a new account to settle, a debt of kindness that I can only repay by ensuring that others have the same chance that you have given me." He told her of his plan to use his wealth not to accumulate more power, but to help others to create a foundation that would provide loans to small farmers and entrepreneurs. Loans based not on collateral, but on character. He would be a different kind of banker, a banker who invested in dreams, not just in assets. And so on a hot, dusty afternoon in Redemption, Texas, a new partnership was formed. It was a partnership born of deception and despair, of kindness and redemption. It was a partnership between a widow who had lost everything and a banker who had finally found something worth having. The story of the young widow and the stranger who forgave her debt became a local legend, a tale told and retold in the small towns and on the sprawling ranches of West Texas. It was a story of hope, a story of second chances, a story that reminded people that even in the harshest of landscapes, in the darkest of times, a single act of kindness could change the world. Abigail Dawson, with the help of her unlikely partner, transformed her small, struggling farm into a thriving oasis, a testament to her resilience and the enduring power of the human spirit. And Bartholomew Hayes, the man who had once been known for his heart of stone, became known for something else entirely. He became known as the banker who had a heart, the man who had learned that the greatest return on any investment was the one that was measured not in gold, but in gratitude. The debt had been forgiven, but a new one had been created, a debt of kindness, a debt that could never be fully repaid, but one that would be honored every day in the lives of the two people who had been brought together by a shared meal on a hot, dusty day in a place called Redemption. What began as a simple act of compassion, sharing a last meal, blossomed into a story of forgiveness, redemption, and the extraordinary power of a second chance. Abigail and Mr. Hayes, two souls lost in their own deserts of grief and greed, found in each other an unexpected salvation. Their story reminds us that beneath the surface of every stranger there is a story, and that the greatest debts we owe are not of money, but of kindness. If this story of hope in the heart of the Wild West touched your heart, please give this video a thumbs up, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe to our channel for more true tales of history's hidden heroes. Your support helps us keep these incredible stories alive.